The cabin, tucked deep in the Maine woods, had been Logan Cole's sanctuary for over a year. Time had blurred since the last of the grief had hit, a slow, dull ache that settled deep in his bones and eventually hollowed him out. He had not been much for company even before, but the loss had amplified the old itch for solitude, pushing him further into the embrace of the wild, where the only echoes were his own footsteps and the rustle of pine needles under a ceaseless wind. He had been a forester for years, knew these woods, this section of the state, like the back of his calloused hand, every gnarled root, every moss-covered boulder, the secret paths deer took through the thickest underbrush. He knew where the best blackberries grew in August, where the red-tailed hawk nested, and the exact spot where the old logging road vanished into nothing but saplings and forgotten history. The forest was his refuge, a labyrinth of comfort he understood. That comfort, however, had begun to fray at the edges, a subtle unraveling that started weeks ago. It was nothing he could point to with a finger, not at first, but more a shift in the hum of the forest. The usual chorus of chirps, scuttles, and distant calls had quieted. The chattering squirrels, the rustling field mice, the flitting songbirds, their numbers had dwindled, their vibrant presence muted. Logan, with his finely tuned senses from years spent living and working off the land, had noticed the change in the silence. It was not the peace of a snow-laden winter night. It was an absence, a hollow quiet that pressed in, leaving him with an unsettled feeling as if the forest was holding its breath. Then came the tracks. He initially dismissed the tracks as those of an unusually large bear. He then considered a rogue moose, but their sheer size and odd configuration began to bother him. They were too long, too wide, with claws that dug deep, unnatural gouges into the damp earth, unlike any claw marks he had ever catalogued in his extensive field guides. These were not the rounded plodding prints of a black bear, nor the splayed, cloven hooves of an elk. These were different, predatory, leaving an impression of immense power and an unnerving intelligence behind each step. They appeared sporadically, sometimes deep in a secluded ravine he rarely visited, other times unnervingly close to the creek that ran past his cabin. He found himself scanning the tree line more often, his hand instinctively resting on the cold steel of the old hunting rifle propped by the door. A prickle ran down his spine, a primal unease that whispered of being watched, an animal awareness he had not felt since a young timber wolf had trailed him for 3 miles during a particularly harsh winter. This, however, felt far older, far more potent. One night, the air thick and heavy with the scent of impending rain, Logan was out on his usual perimeter patrol, the beam of his heavy-duty flashlight cutting a path through the gloom. The quiet was profound, almost suffocating. Even the crickets had fallen silent. He moved with the quiet grace of a man who knew every twist of the terrain, his boots barely disturbing the fallen leaves. Deeper into the woods, where the ancient pines stood sentinel, their branches interwoven like gnarled fingers against the bruised purple sky, he saw them. 2 massive wolves. They stood at least 3 feet at the shoulder, their coats a blend of charcoal and frost, eyes that burned with an unsettling, intelligent amber in the beam of his light. They were not snarling, were not aggressive in the way a cornered wild animal might be. Instead, they regarded him with a stillness that felt more like judgment than animal curiosity. Their size was astounding, easily twice that of any eastern gray wolf he had ever encountered, their frames lean and powerful, like finely tuned engines built for speed and destruction. A tremor, cold and sharp, ran through Logan, bypassing fear to lodge somewhere deeper in the primal part of his brain that recognized true apex predation. But then, they began to move. They did not move towards him, but past him, slowly, deliberately herding him. One took point, moving silently through the undergrowth, occasionally glancing back, its eyes fixing on him with an unnerving purpose. The other brought up the rear, its presence a cold pressure at his back. They were not attacking, they were leading him. Deeper, always deeper into the black heart of the woods, where even the faintest glimmer of distant civilization was swallowed by the impenetrable canopy. They brought him to a clearing he had never seen before, a natural bowl in the earth, ringed by ancient oaks, whose lowest branches scraped the ground. Moonlight, now breaking through the clouds, bathed the scene in an ethereal silver, illuminating a single figure standing at the center, Silas Thorne. He was a man Logan instinctively knew was dangerous, a magnetic force that pulled at something deep inside. Silas stood tall, broad-shouldered, with a presence that radiated ancient power, a knowing that predated the very trees surrounding them. His eyes, even from 20 yards, were piercing, a startling shade of green that absorbed the moonlight, holding secrets Logan could not begin to fathom. He was charismatic, yes, but with an underlying current of absolute, unyielding authority. Logan felt simultaneously terrified and drawn in. A moth to a flame he knew would burn him. The wolves that had herded him now melted into the shadows behind Silas, their forms no longer visible. Yet their presence was a palpable weight in the air. Silas's voice, when he spoke, was a low rumble, rich and resonant, carrying across the clearing without needing to be loud. It was not a question, but a statement. "You have sought us, Logan Cole, and we have found you." He offered Logan a trial, explaining it not as a test of strength, but as an opportunity, an invitation to join them. He did not elaborate on what join them meant, but the implication hung heavy in the cool night air. The unknown, the sheer adrenaline surging through Logan's veins, the desperate need for escape from his own lonely, mundane existence, it all coalesced, overriding his fear. A strange, almost giddy certainty bloomed in his chest. This was it. This was the change he had unknowingly craved. He agreed, a single nod that felt monumental, as if he were signing away his old life with an invisible ink. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that this decision would alter the course of his life forever. The rest of the night passed in a blur of disquieting strangeness. Logan remained in the clearing with Silas and the others. Though their human forms remained elusive, their presence felt more than seen in the surrounding shadows. He did not transform, did not feel any sudden dramatic shift in his physical being. Yet as the hours bled into one another, he felt it. An invisible thread, a humming current, connecting him to these powerful beings, to the very earth beneath his feet. A surge of strength, cold and clean, flowed into him, a physical sensation that made his skin prickle. The forest itself, in its ancient, wild heart, responded to his presence, acknowledging him, claiming him. He was not one of them, not yet, but he was certainly no longer just Logan Cole, the lonely forester. When he woke the next morning, curled instinctively at the base of one of the ancient oaks, The sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky in hues of bruised peach and pale gold. He felt strangely rested, every nerve alive, every muscle humming with an unfamiliar energy. But beneath the physical revitalization lay something far more profound. His world, once so meticulously rational, so neatly categorized, had been upended. The quiet certainty of the familiar had shattered, replaced by an intoxicating, terrifying sense of the unknown. He was horrified, yes, a deep, chilling dread that clawed at his throat. But beneath that, a raw, exhilarating wonder pulsed. He had become part of something ancient, something inexplicable, something that hummed just beyond the veil of human comprehension. He had stepped across a threshold, and there was no turning back. The walk back to his cabin felt like a dream, the forest floor strangely soft beneath his feet. Logan tried to rationalize it all away, attributing it to stress and exhaustion. He considered a particularly potent strain of mushroom he had stumbled upon during his night patrol, playing tricks on his mind. He told himself it was the lingering shock of the encounter, the primal fear that had manifested as something more. He told himself these things, but his body and mind refused to listen. A restless energy thrummed beneath his skin, an undeniable current that refused to be dismissed. His dreams, when sleep finally claimed him in short, fitful bursts, were no longer the muted, fading echoes of his past. They were vivid, saturated with the greens and browns of the forest, filled with the exhilarating sensation of running, swift and silent, through moon-dappled shadows, a primal freedom he had never known. The first barely perceptible changes began with his sensory perception. He sat on his porch swing, sipping lukewarm coffee, and suddenly the distant hoot of an owl, usually a faint echo in the pre-dawn stillness, was crisp, distinct, as though it were perched just outside his window. He could separate the sounds of different insects, the subtle rustle of a mouse in the undergrowth 100 yards away. The world had sharpened, clarified. Then came the smells. The rank scent of decaying leaves was suddenly nuanced with the metallic tang of damp earth, the rich, musky perfume of a fox's den hidden deep in the ravine, the sweet, cloying aroma of late-blooming honeysuckle wafting from half a mile off. His vision, too, sharpened. He found himself navigating the deep woods at dusk with an uncanny ease, the faint moonlight and star glow illuminating details he had once needed a flashlight to discern. The patterns of bark on the old pines, the intricate lacework of shadows cast by skeletal branches. It all came into startling relief. This new acuity, this undeniable heightening of his senses was both terrifying and utterly captivating. A veil had lifted, revealing a world far richer, far more immediate than he had ever known. Soon the physical manifestations began. One afternoon, while splitting a stubborn oak log for his wood stove, he found himself lifting the heavy maul with a startling, almost effortless grace. The wood, which usually required several powerful blows, split with a single resounding crack. Later, wrestling a fallen branch out of a deer path, he pulled it free with a yank that nearly sent him tumbling backward, the branch snapping with a sound like a rifle shot. His movements, once deliberate and methodical, were now quicker, more precise, imbued with a predatory fluidity he recognized from observing wild animals. A sudden burst of speed would send him across his cabin's small yard in a flash, an unbidden agility that felt both exhilarating and deeply alien. He found himself running through the woods, not out of necessity, but simply for the sheer joy of it, his breath coming easily, his legs pumping with tireless energy. He moved like an animal, a hunter, and the realization chilled him. Logan desperately tried to find a rational explanation. It had to be the lingering adrenaline, the self-suggestion of a tired mind, a kind of extreme placebo effect. He was under immense stress. His mind played tricks, conjuring up illusions to cope with the inexplicable. But then he caught his reflection in the cabin's grimy window pane or glanced into the mottled surface of his shaving mirror, and he sometimes saw it. A flicker, a momentary gleam of predatory amber in his own hazel eyes, a subtle shadow that hinted at elongated canines just beneath his lips. His posture, too, had shifted, adopting a subtle, almost unnoticeable crouch, a readiness that spoke of coiled power. The fear of losing control, of succumbing to something monstrous, was a cold knot in his stomach, but it was invariably mixed with an intoxicating, almost addictive thrill. The rush of new strength, the raw, untamed power that now coursed through his veins. In the deepest parts of his being, Logan felt an undeniable, almost magnetic pull towards the forest, towards the hidden clearing where Silas Thorne had found him. The world of humans, his past life with its routines and quiet grief, now felt distant, almost irrelevant. He was no longer entirely human. He was something else, caught between two worlds, and the wild beckoned with an irresistible urgency. He began spending his nights not in restless sleep, but roaming the dark woods, his senses alight, instinctively seeking his own, though he had not yet fully articulated what that meant. He felt the phantom thread, the subtle, invisible tether that connected him to Silas and the others, a silent call he could not ignore. Silas Thorne himself would occasionally appear to Logan, always alone, always in his human form, his piercing green eyes holding a quiet, ancient wisdom. He never revealed the full nature of the pack, never fully explained the ancient connection he had hinted at. Instead, he became Logan's cryptic mentor. He taught Logan not with words, but with subtle gestures and deep, resonant truths, how to control these new, terrifyingly acute senses, how to flow through the forest as though he were part of the wind, how to melt into the shadows and become one with the rustling leaves. "Feel the forest, Logan," Silas would say, his voice barely a whisper, yet carrying with the weight of ages. "Breathe with it, become it, and the forest will answer." Logan absorbed these lessons like a starving man, his human mind fighting for understanding while his burgeoning animal instincts devoured the knowledge. It became terrifyingly clear that his past, human life was slowly, irrevocably fading. The old Logan Cole, the lonely forester, was diminishing, his edges blurring, giving way to something wilder, something new and utterly untamed. He abandoned any pretense of returning to his old routines. The cabin became merely a temporary stop, a place to shed the last vestiges of a skin that no longer fit. He found himself completely immersed in the profound, unsettling mysteries that the forest now revealed to him, in the intoxicating embrace of his new, terrifyingly inhuman abilities. He was a creature reborn, straddling the chasm between man and beast, and the whispers of the wild were growing louder, promising a power he both craved and feared. The transformation from observer to participant was a gradual one, seamless in its insidious progress. Logan began joining the night hunts, a silent, primal ritual that bound him ever closer to the pack. He came to know the others, not just as shadows in the clearing, but as individuals, their human and semi-beast forms flickering in and out of his perception. There was Luke, Silas Thorne's quiet right hand, always calm, always reliable, with eyes that held a deep, unreadable wisdom. Jared, all lean muscle and restless energy, impulsive and quick to anger, forever itching for a fight, hungry for risk. Tyler, who rarely spoke, his presence a study in silent observation, his senses so acute he could track an elusive presence. And Mason, the youngest, a raw, untamed force, all instinct and wild abandon. Logan learned their rhythms, their silent communications, the subtle shifts in their postures that spoke volumes. In that state, not quite fully human, not yet fully transformed, but imbued with potent bestial traits, Logan ran with them. The sensation was intoxicating, a pure, unadulterated rush. The forest became a blur of green and black beneath his pounding feet, the ground a vibrant tapestry of scents and sounds that sang to his heightened senses. He felt the wind whip past his face, heard the chorus of howls from his brethren, a sound that vibrated deep in his chest, claiming him. The sheer speed, the undeniable strength, the profound, exhilarating unity with the natural world. It was a drug, potent and addictive. He had never felt so alive, so powerful, so utterly free. The gnawing grief, the quiet despair of his old life were momentarily silenced, drowned out by the thrum of the hunt, the primal beat of his new existence. Each hunt became a ritual, a sacred dance of predator and prey. Logan learned to read the subtle signs, the faint scent of deer on the wind, the almost invisible scratch marks of a buck on a sapling. He learned to move with the silent grace of a shadow, his weight distributed perfectly, his steps falling inaudibly on the pine needles. He learned to anticipate the movements of their prey, to predict the subtle shifts in the wind that carried their scent. The primitive thrill of the chase, the intoxicating scent of fear and exertion consumed him, overriding all his lingering human doubts, eclipsing every fear. In the heat of the moment, with the pack running as one, a seamless, deadly machine, Logan felt a belonging he had never known. He was a part of something ancient, something unstoppable. Silas Thorne, ever the stoic leader, constantly reinforced one single immutable law. The main rule is one: never be seen by humans. He offered no elaborate explanations, no justifications. His words were delivered with the weight of ancient stone, an absolute command that permitted no argument, no questioning. He simply emphasized its absolute existential importance. Logan, still new to this clandestine world, interpreted it as a necessary rule of conspiracy, a means of protecting their secret existence from a world that would undoubtedly fear and persecute them. He understood the need for discretion, for secrecy, but he had not yet grasped the true bone-chilling depth of that single, unwavering commandment. It was about more than just secrecy. It was about survival, not just of the pack, but of their very nature. Yet, a subtle unease occasionally pricked at Logan. He noticed Luke, the calm, watchful lieutenant, sometimes regarded him with a flicker of anxiety, a fleeting shadow of regret in his eyes. It happened most often when Logan, caught up in the thrill, displayed almost reckless abandon during a hunt, or when a surge of newfound power made him overconfident, pushing the boundaries too far. These glances bothered Logan, a quiet warning in the face of his burgeoning arrogance, but he quickly dismissed them. Luke was simply cautious, he told himself. a seasoned warrior who understood the dangers better than a newcomer. Logan's own intoxicating rush of power often overshadowed any such subtle warnings. Sometimes in the hushed moments just before dawn, when the first blush of color touched the eastern sky and the beast within them began to recede, Logan caught glimpses of the human remnants in his pack mates. Their faces, still subtly altered, showed exhaustion from the night's exertions, but also a profound, deep satisfaction. He wondered about their double lives, the human facades they must maintain in the sunlit world, the silent suffering and exhilaration of being caught between two natures. He saw the faint lines of worry around Luke's eyes, the fleeting flicker of something akin to wistfulness in Jared's usually aggressive gaze. But he never dared to ask. The unspoken pact of their shared secret a formidable barrier to such questions. The unspoken was often more powerful than any word. As the weeks turned into months, Logan's overconfidence grew, hardening into an almost impenetrable shell. He began to see himself not just as a member of the pack, but as an indispensable part, an equal. The sheer power that flowed through him, the ease with which he moved through the wild, the exhilaration of the hunt, it all made him feel invincible, truly merged with the untamed spirit of the forest. He started to ignore the faint, instinctive warnings that occasionally whispered at the back of his mind, the little voices of caution that spoke of the dangers of hubris. He relied more and more on his new, formidable strength, on his sharpened senses, on the beast that now pulsed just beneath his skin, eager to be unleashed. He was flying high, oblivious to the precipice he was rapidly approaching. The forest, once his sanctuary, was now merely a playground for his newfound, dangerous power. The night was a whirlwind of scent and sound, a symphony of the hunt. Rain had fallen earlier, leaving the forest floor soft and fragrant, the air cool and crisp. It was perfect hunting weather. The pack moved as one, a dark, fluid shadow flowing through the woods, their senses tuned to the faintest tremor in the earth, the most subtle shift in the wind. A magnificent buck, antlers wide and impressive, had been sighted deep within their territory, a challenge to their prowess, and the chase had begun. Jared, ever the hothead, ran at Logan's flank, his eyes gleaming with a reckless excitement. "Too slow, Cole," he growled, his voice a low, guttural rumble that was more beast than man. "You hold back. What's the matter? Afraid of a little speed?" He knew exactly how to prick Logan's pride. The taunt struck a nerve. Logan, fueled by adrenaline and the intoxicating surge of his new power, felt a competitive fire ignite. He would show Jared. He would show them all. He poured on the speed, pushing himself beyond what he had thought possible, the beast within him howling for dominance. The focus narrowed, honing in on the fleeing deer, its muscles bunched and powerful. The world became a blur of motion, a primal tunnel vision where nothing existed but the chase, the thrumming anticipation of the kill. The warning voice, the rational human part of his brain that usually kept him within the pack's established boundaries, was drowned out by the roar of his inner beast. He did not notice the familiar scent of pine giving way to something else, something subtly artificial, a faint tang of exhaust fumes and wood smoke. He did not register how far he had pushed, how far he had strayed from the deep, wild heart of their territory. The adrenaline, the overwhelming desire to prove himself, consumed him entirely. Only when the trees began to thin, giving way to a scrubbier, more ordered landscape, did a sliver of awareness break through the haze. He caught the distinct smell of human habitation. Charcoal from a backyard grill, the faint chemical scent of laundry detergent, the underlying sweetness of freshly cut grass. He saw the distant, soft glow of electric lights, diffused by the humid air, painting a faint halo on the low-hanging clouds. He was on the very edge of a small, nondescript town, a cluster of houses clinging to the forest's fringe, but the thrill of the hunt still coursed through him, thick and compelling. The buck was close, just beyond a cluster of overgrown bushes, its breath coming in ragged gasps. He could not stop now. In his single-minded pursuit, Logan broke through the last line of trees and found himself in a neglected backyard, littered with a child's forgotten tricycle and an overturned plastic kiddie pool. The buck, cornered, darted towards a shed, scraping its antlers against the aluminum siding. Logan, muscles coiled, let out a sound. It was not a human cry, nor was it a full, resonant howl. It was something in between, a guttural, terrifying snarl of pure predatory frustration, a sound ripped from the very throat of the wild, unadulterated beast he was becoming. The light flicked on. A woman, silhouetted in the doorway of a small, modest house, stepped out onto a wooden porch, drawn by the ungodly noise. She held a steaming mug, enjoying a quiet moment before bed. Her name was Sarah. Her eyes, wide with confusion, slowly found him, frozen in the yard. In that terrible moment, Logan knew he was not fully himself. His eyes, he was certain, glowed with a feral, predatory fire, reflecting the porch light with an unholy intensity. His face, he felt, was contorted, stretched, pulled by the shifting shadows of the beast, a grotesque mask of half-human, half-animal ferocity. His movements, though he was utterly still, felt unnatural, subtly jerky. A primal readiness coiled in his limbs. She did not see a man in the shadows, startled by a deer. She saw something monstrous, something ancient and nightmarish, a primordial terror that defied reason. Sarah's mug dropped to the porch with a ceramic shattering that echoed in the sudden, terrible silence. She let out a scream, high-pitched and piercing, full of a pure, unadulterated horror that tore at the fabric of the night. It was a sound that would haunt Logan for weeks to come. The spell of the hunt, the haze of adrenaline, shattered instantly. The reality of his transgression slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. The rule. The one rule. He had broken it. In a surge of blind panic, Logan turned and fled, crashing through the bushes, scrambling back into the welcome darkness of the woods. He ran, not as a hunter, but as terrified prey, hoping her scream would be lost in the vast indifference of the night, and that her vision would be dismissed as a nightmare born of shadows and an overactive imagination. He returned to the pack's gathering place, not the clearing, but a smaller, temporary meeting point they used after particularly far-ranging hunts. The others were there, their forms shifting in the pre-dawn gloom, their breath coming in ragged pants. But no one spoke. No one greeted him. A chilling, heavy silence descended, a sound louder than any howl. Every eye in the pack was on him, their gazes like cold, hard stones. He did not need words to know. They knew. Silas Thorne stood apart, his posture one of quiet power. He looked at Logan, and in his eyes, Logan saw no anger, no furious condemnation. Only a profound disappointment, a deep, heavy sorrow that was far more terrible than any rage. It was the sorrow of an ancient being watching a sacred law violated, a future put at risk. The main rule had been broken, and its terrible weight pressed down on them all, palpable in the cold, still air. The comfortable illusion of brotherhood, of belonging, shattered around Logan, leaving him exposed and utterly alone. The silence that followed Logan's return to the pack was more terrifying than any snarl or growl. It was a suffocating quiet, heavy with judgment. No one spoke of the incident. No one needed to. The knowledge hung in the air, a poisonous miasma that seeped into Logan's bones. He felt their estrangement acutely. The easy camaraderie of the hunt, the shared thrill of the chase, had vanished, replaced by a cold, impenetrable indifference. His former comrades, the beings he had come to think of as brothers, now avoided his gaze, their eyes sliding past him as though he were an unseen presence, an unwelcome specter. Logan was utterly isolated. He tried to speak with Luke, to gauge his reaction, to find some shred of understanding or even empathy in the steady, reliable lieutenant. But Luke, whose quiet warmth had once been a comforting presence, merely averted his eyes, his face a mask of tense, unyielding silence. Jared, usually so boisterous, now looked at Logan with an open, contemptuous sneer, a venomous disdain that stung more than any physical blow. Tyler and Mason, the silent tracker and the wild youth, avoided him entirely, their forms melting into the shadows whenever he approached. He was an outcast, a pariah within the very group he had so eagerly sought to join. The brotherhood was severed, the invisible thread that had bound him to them now frayed and broken. Every rustle of leaves, every distant snap of a twig, every fleeting shadow now held a sinister edge. Logan's heightened senses, once a thrilling gift, now became a torment, amplifying his burgeoning paranoia. He knew with a chilling certainty that the pack knew him intimately. They knew his habits, his favored routes through the woods, the secret places he retreated to for solace. Every corner of the forest, once a sanctuary, now felt like a potential trap. He knew his days were not merely numbered but predetermined, counting down to an inescapable end. Yet the true scale of the impending doom, the precise nature of the reckoning, remained shrouded in a terrifying uncertainty. He was a condemned man, walking unknowingly towards the gallows. Driven by a gnawing guilt and a morbid curiosity, Logan cautiously made his way back towards Sarah's house a few nights later. He approached through the deepest shadows, his movements hushed, his senses straining for any sign of danger. The house stood dark and silent, a stark contrast to the vivid terror of their encounter. It was abandoned. A faint, unsettling smell of disturbance hung in the air, something metallic, something that spoke of fear. On the damp ground by the porch, where Sarah's mug had shattered, he found them. Clear, undeniable wolf tracks, enormous and predatory, pressed deep into the earth. There were also faint, disturbing signs of a struggle. A patch of disturbed earth, a small, faded scrap of fabric that was part of a blouse. A horrifying conclusion solidified in Logan's mind, cold and sharp as a sliver of ice. The pack had been here. They had cleaned up the loose end, ensured that there would be no witness. Sarah was gone, swallowed by the same terrible secret he had so foolishly exposed. A wave of profound horror washed over him, not just for the woman he had terrified, but for himself. He had seen the depths of their ruthlessness, and he was next, in this suffocating atmosphere of impending judgment. Logan found his mind turning uncontrollably to the spectral image of his human past. He recalled the faces of his loved ones, now long gone, the quiet routines of his old life, the simple comforts of a world that now was impossibly distant. He saw the mundane objects in his cabin, the worn armchair, the dusty books, the faded photographs, and they felt alien, relics of a life he had irrevocably left behind. He recognized, with a searing, painful clarity, how far he had strayed, how completely he had surrendered to the wild, how irreversible the changes had truly become. He was a creature of the forest now, but the forest was turning on him. After several more nights of tense, isolated wandering, a silent, non-verbal command from Silas Thorne reached him, cutting through the static of his fear with unsettling clarity. It was an imperative, a deep, resonant summons that brooked no disobedience. Assemble in the abandoned barn on the very edge of their hunting grounds. The message was unmistakable. The atmosphere surrounding him, thick with dread, and the cold certainty of his impending fate, now solidified into an inescapable doom. Logan understood. This was the end. His time in the pack, his brief, exhilarating, terrifying glimpse into their world, was over. The journey to the barn felt endless, each step a leaden weight, each rustle in the undergrowth a potential ambush. The air grew colder, heavy with the metallic tang of rust and decay that emanated from the old structure. He walked towards it not as a man going to a meeting, but as a condemned soul walking to his execution. There was no turning back, no hope of escape. The ancient, unwritten laws of the wild of the pack demanded their due, and Logan Cole was the price. He felt a deep, chilling resignation settle over him, knowing that the journey he had so eagerly begun in the clearing weeks ago was now reaching its terrifying, inevitable conclusion. The abandoned barn stood silhouetted against the bruised pre-dawn sky, a hulking, dilapidated monument to forgotten labor. Its weathered siding sagged, its roof a skeletal patchwork of missing shingles, yet it exuded a grim, imposing authority. Inside, the air was cold and stale, thick with the scent of damp earth, old hay, and something else, something primal, something expectant. The pack was already assembled, a silent semicircle of dark forms coalescing in the gloom. Their eyes, 100 pinpricks of light, fixed unblinkingly on Logan as he stepped through the gaping maw of the barn's broken door. The weight of their collective gaze was immense, crushing, the tension in the air so thick it felt like something he could taste, something metallic and bitter on his tongue. He stood at the center of their silent judgment, utterly exposed. Silas Thorne entered slowly, his figure emerging from the deep shadows at the far end of the barn, his imposing form gradually solidifying against the faint light filtering through a crack in the wall. His face, etched with ancient lines and grim resolve, expressed neither anger nor pity. There was only a cold, unyielding determination, a stoic acceptance of an immutable truth. He was the embodiment of an ancient law, a force that transcended mere human emotion, a living relic of a deeper, harsher order. The air itself crackled with his presence, vibrating with an unspoken authority that none dared to challenge. Silas stopped a few paces from Logan, his voice a low, resonant rumble, heavy and deep as a distant thunderclap. It was not an accusation hurled in fury, but a simple, devastating statement of fact. "You let yourself be seen, Logan Cole," he pronounced, his words echoing in the cavernous space. "No one must ever know that we exist." He did not raise his voice, did not need to. The gravity of his tone, the terrible finality of his pronouncement resonated deep within Logan, confirming the verdict he had already known in his gut. There was no room for denial, no plea that could alter his fate. Silas then articulated the true, chilling reason for his judgment. This was not about revenge, he explained, his voice devoid of emotion. This was about necessity, a stark, brutal truth that underpinned their very existence. Humanity, once they knew of us, once they truly understood what we are, Silas continued, his eyes, dark pools in the dim light, fixed on Logan. They would hunt us. They would destroy us. They would not rest until every last one of us was eradicated. Logan, the rule breaker, the one who had exposed them, was not a criminal to be punished, but a biological imperative to be removed. He was a flaw in the system, a threat to their entire species. Silas's final words resonated with a cold, absolute certainty that pierced Logan to the core. Now you are prey. Logan looked around at the faces of those he had briefly considered brothers, his erstwhile companions in the intoxicating freedom of the hunt. He searched for a flicker of recognition, a spark of the camaraderie they had once shared, but in their eyes he saw only a cold, functional acceptance of the inevitable. There was no hatred, no personal animosity, merely the dispassionate understanding of a threat that needed to be neutralized. He was no longer Logan Cole, the man, the fellow hunter. He was an object, a problem, a danger to their survival, and he would be dealt with. He was a living breach in their ancient security, and the ancient security demanded his obliteration. Then came the cruelest twist. Silas, his voice still low, but now with a subtle, chilling edge of ritual, declared, "You will have this night, Logan Cole. Until the moon sets and the first hint of dawn touches the sky, you have a head start." It was not an act of mercy, Logan understood with a fresh wave of terror. It was a calculated psychological cruelty designed to prolong his agony, to allow them to savor the hunt, to draw out the dreadful anticipation. It was a tribute to some ancient predatory ritual, a dark custom of the hunt passed down through generations of their kind. They would not simply kill him. They would break him, play with him, reduce him to the terrified animal he had become. As Silas uttered those words, the atmosphere in the barn shifted, subtly but irrevocably. The heavy, stagnant air crackled with an unseen energy, a palpable change in the collective consciousness of the pack. They no longer stood in silent judgment. They stood as predators. The semicircle parted, creating a wide, unobstructed path for Logan to flee. He felt it then, a jolt of raw, instinctual terror mixed with a dawning awareness. Each one of them, from Luke to Mason, had activated their hunting instincts. He was no longer a member of the pack. He was no longer even human in their eyes. He was the quarry. The hunt, a terrifying, relentless game of cat and mouse, had begun. He was merely the mouse, granted a brief, agonizing reprieve before the inevitable chase. Logan did not hesitate. The moment Silas's words hung in the air, he bolted, a raw, primal scream locked in his throat. He burst from the decrepit barn, a desperate blur against the encroaching night, plunging headlong into the familiar labyrinth of the forest. Panic clawed at his insides, a cold, constricting hand squeezing his heart, but years of ingrained forester instincts, honed by countless hours spent traversing these very woods, surged to the surface. He ran, not blindly but with a desperate, strategic cunning, choosing the gnarliest, most impassable routes. Thickets of thorny blackberry bushes, treacherous stretches of boggy ground, steep, rocky ravines, anything to gain precious minutes. to buy a sliver of time against the relentless, inevitable pursuit. He was a master of these woods, and now those skills were his only shield. He wove through the undergrowth, snatching at low-hanging branches, breaking off small, thorny twigs to strew in his wake, primitive makeshift traps designed not to harm, but to delay, to create a faint, audible warning of their approach. He moved through a shallow, icy creek for nearly a mile, disturbing the pebbled bottom as little as possible, then scrambled onto a rocky outcrop, leaving no discernible tracks for hundreds of feet. He found patches of pungent wild mint and crushed pine needles rubbing the oils onto his clothes, trying desperately to mask his scent, to throw off the tracking abilities he knew were terrifyingly precise. He was fighting for his life with every trick he possessed, every ounce of his knowledge of the wild. With the first pale blush of dawn, the psychological torment began. A howl rippled through the hills, not a single furious cry, but a chorus, a wave of sound that rose and fell, echoing through the valleys and across the ridges. It was not aggressive. It was something far worse. It was mocking. It was a sound that told him they were there, always there, just beyond the edge of sight, feeling his every panicked breath, his every desperate movement. They were close enough to let him know, but far enough to let him suffer, to let the fear fester. He heard them, Luke's voice distinct at times, Jared's at others, sometimes the unified, chilling chorus, but he never saw them. They were spectral presences in the periphery, phantom threats that turned every rustle of leaves into a potential ambush. Each passing day tightened the invisible noose around Logan. Their howls grew louder, more insistent, the flickering gleam of their eyes in the absolute darkness of the deep woods appearing closer, more frequently. He felt their presence not just with his ears and eyes, but with something deeper, something primal, a thrumming vibration in the earth, a subtle shift in the forest's energy. He understood then, with a horrifying clarity, that they were not merely tracking his physical presence. They felt his breath, yes, his pounding pulse, the scent of his sweat, but more profoundly they felt his fear. It was a beacon in the night, a scent to them more potent than any physical trail. His fear, once a private agony, had become his biggest enemy, drawing them in like moths to a flame. The pack hunted with a terrifying, almost surgical efficiency. They moved as a single, coordinated unit, a deadly symphony of predatory instinct and ancient cunning. They did not simply chase him, they herded him. Every path he chose, every desperate turn he made, was anticipated, cut off by a silent, unseen flank of hunters. They were funneling him, guiding him inexorably towards some unknown destination. Logan watched them from hiding, a silent, terrified observer of their deadly perfection. He was a forester, a man of the woods, but he was utterly, hopelessly outmatched against such an organized, ancient force. His human mind, for all its cleverness, was no match for their primal, collective intelligence. He sought refuge in the forgotten places of the forest, the remnants of an older world. He huddled in the damp, echoing chambers of an abandoned iron mine, its entrance choked with overgrown vines. He scrambled into the crumbling concrete shell of an old, forgotten bunker, buried deep beneath a mound of earth, its air stale and heavy. But each time he knew it was only a temporary reprieve, a fleeting moment of false security. They always found him. He was once one of them, and because of that, they understood the logic of his movements, the patterns of his fear. They knew how a cornered animal thought, how it tried to escape, because they had spent generations studying the prey. He was merely an extension of their own, twisted reflection, and his thoughts, his strategies, were an open book to them. Hunger gnawed at his gut, a constant dull ache that was slowly replaced by the sharp pangs of starvation. Thirst parched his throat, making every breath a rasping effort. The constant tension, the unending fight-or-flight response, the complete absence of sleep, it all began to slowly, inexorably, break Logan down. His once strong, resilient body, forged by years of hard labor in the woods, now felt like a fragile, hollow shell. His spirit, once fueled by a quiet determination, was eroding, replaced by a profound, soul-deep exhaustion. He found himself questioning his ability to survive, his will to continue. The forest, once his solace, had become his relentless, omnipresent enemy, and he was losing the fight. During his frantic, days-long flight, Logan stumbled upon a dilapidated structure, mostly swallowed by the encroaching forest. It was an old hunting lodge. He knew it had long served as a trapper's cabin, long abandoned. The wooden walls were rotting, the roof partially collapsed, but inside, amidst the dust and cobwebs, he found faint, disturbing traces of human presence. A rusty tin cup, a child's leather moccasin, a yellowed, water-stained photograph of a smiling family, their faces blurred by time and damp. The remnants felt strange, abruptly interrupted, as though those who had once inhabited the space had simply vanished mid-sentence, leaving their lives hanging in the air. A cold dread settled in Logan's chest. He was not the first to draw the pack's attention. He was not even close. His mind, already frayed by exhaustion and terror, began to connect the dots. He recalled the whispered local legends, the campfire tales of strange disappearances in these very woods, stories he had always dismissed as products of overactive imaginations and sad, mundane tragedies. The hikers who went missing without a trace, the hunters who simply vanished, never to be seen again. Now, he saw them not as mere legends, but as chilling echoes, grim records of the pack's activities over generations. He tried, with a desperate, fragmented urgency, to piece together how they had lived before him, how many silent witnesses the pack had neutralized over the years, how many ordinary lives had been devoured by the ancient secret he had so carelessly exposed. The scale of their hidden horror began to truly dawn on him, vast and terrifying. In one of his desperate attempts to find cover, to escape the relentless pressure, Logan found himself scrambling through a dense thicket of spruce trees, their needles scratching at his face and hands. He burst through into a small, sun-dappled glade, only to come face to face with Jared. The younger pack member was not fully transformed, but his human features were stretched, contorted, overlaid with a bestial hunger. His eyes, usually just aggressive, now burned with a malevolent, savage glee. He stalked towards Logan, a slow, deliberate movement, enjoying the palpable fear radiating from his former comrade. "Look at you!" Jared sneered, his voice a low, guttural growl, full of mockery. "The mighty forester, running like a rabbit. You tasted power, did you not, Cole? You liked it, but you could not control it, now you pay." He did not attack, not directly. He simply circled, his movements fluid and predatory, luxuriating in Logan's terror, displaying the pack's true, unadulterated ruthlessness. It was a short, terrifying encounter, a stark, visceral reminder of the merciless nature of the beings hunting him. The image of Sarah, her face contorted in a scream of pure horror, continued to haunt Logan. Driven by a desperate, agonizing guilt, he risked another detour, meticulously backtracking through the treacherous terrain towards the remote edge of the town where her house stood. He found the small, unassuming house still empty, eerily silent, its windows dark and lifeless. But this time, he was ready for what he would find. On the ground near the porch, amidst the broken pottery shards of her dropped mug, were not just wolf tracks, but clearer signs of struggle. Upturned earth, a trampled flower bed, and a small, crumpled patch of cloth, undeniably a part of Sarah's nightgown, torn and mud-stained. The evidence was irrefutable. The pack had indeed paid her a visit. They had left no witnesses. The horrifying truth settled deep in Logan's gut, a cold, sickening weight. They were methodical. They were absolute. And he was next. The horror of understanding what his former brothers were truly capable of, the terrifying scope of their ancient hidden menace, pushed Logan further towards a psychological breaking point. His paranoia intensified, warping his perception of reality. He realized that his continued existence, any lingering connection he held to the outside world, was a profound threat to them. His life, and the very knowledge of their existence, were anathema to their survival. He was not just hunted. He was an infection to be purged. His enhanced senses, once a thrilling gift, now became an agonizing curse. Every rustle in the leaves was magnified into a monstrous roar. Every faint scent became a sickening, overwhelming stench. Every shadow a lurking predator. His mind, unable to process the constant amplified sensory input, began to fray at the edges, pushing him closer and closer to madness. He felt the ceaseless, agonizing struggle within him, his last vestiges of human reason, his old self, fighting a losing battle against the raw, unbridled power of the beast that clawed at the walls of his consciousness, desperate to break free and consume him entirely. He found temporary solace, a fleeting respite, in an old, partially collapsed iron mine shaft, its entrance almost completely hidden by a tangle of thorny bushes and fallen trees. The air inside was dense, heavy, and crucially, it muffled the overwhelming assault of scents and sounds from the forest outside. He felt relatively safe. The earth above him a comforting, albeit fragile, barrier. But even as he huddled in the damp, musty darkness, Logan knew it was merely an illusion, a temporary reprieve. They would find him. They always did. The hunt was far from over. The relative quiet of the mine shaft was short-lived. Logan had barely managed to drift into a shallow, fitful sleep when a low, resonant thrumming began to vibrate through the very earth beneath him. It was not a natural tremor. It was a rhythmic, pulsing sound that reverberated deep in his chest, a sound he now knew intimately. The howls began shortly after. No longer distant echoes, but close, terrifyingly immediate, directly above him, palpable and menacing. He felt the cold certainty of it. His temporary refuge had been discovered. The ring, which had been tightening around him for days, was now irrevocably closed. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked through him. But this time it was laced with a chilling realization. This was not just a random discovery. This was not them stumbling upon his hiding place. As he scrambled frantically through a narrow, dark passage, he sensed it, an almost psychic nudge, a subtle manipulation of his choices. They were not just hunting him, they were leading him. Every path he had taken, Every desperate choice, every frantic dash had been anticipated, accounted for, used to funnel him inexorably towards a predetermined destination. He suddenly understood the true, terrifying cunning of the pack. This was not merely a chase. It was a complex, meticulously planned trap designed to corner him, to leave him with no conceivable escape. He was a piece on a chessboard, moved by an unseen, ancient hand, and the end game was rapidly approaching. Exhausted, famished, and teetering on the precipice of madness, Logan's mind began to play tricks. As he ran, branches whipping his face, the forest blurring around him, he started to see them. Ephemeral, spectral figures that shimmered at the edge of his vision. The faces of his loved ones, long gone, now appeared in the shifting shadows, their eyes filled with a phantom sorrow. And then, Sarah. Her face, vivid and terrifying, was there in the darkness, her mouth open in that silent scream of pure horror, a searing brand of his guilt. His past, his failures, his terrible deeds, now collided with his present, a grotesque montage of his unraveling. The terrain grew steeper, the roar of a river growing steadily louder ahead. All avenues of retreat were systematically cut off, blocked by the unseen presence of the pack. He ran, his lungs burning, his legs screaming in protest, knowing with a deep, existential dread that this was his last sprint, his final burst of desperate energy. But he had no idea where he was going, only that he was being driven, like a hunted animal, towards an inevitable end. He felt like a toy, a plaything in the hands of an ancient, ruthless power, a power that reveled in the prolonged agony of its quarry. And then he burst through the last line of trees, gasping, onto the edge of a sheer cliff face. Below, far below, the icy river he knew so well churned and foamed, its relentless current tearing at the rocky banks. There was nowhere else to go. The pack emerged from the shadows, not a wild, uncoordinated rush, but a slow, deliberate encirclement. Their figures, shifting between human and their terrible half-beast forms, materialized against the backdrop of the dark, brooding sky, their eyes glowing with an unholy light, forming a deadly, unbreakable circle around him. Silas Thorne led them, as always, his gaze cold and uncompromising, a verdict in his eyes that needed no words. Logan's gaze darted around the circle, fixing on the faces of his former companions, now his relentless hunters. Jared, his features contorted by a bloodthirsty eagerness, a predatory grin stretching his mouth. Tyler, silent and efficient, his eyes cold calculations, devoid of any warmth. Mason, the youngest, his face a terrifying mask of wild, untamed resolve, the thrill of the kill pulsing in his every fiber. In their eyes, Logan saw no men, no echoes of the human kindness they once possessed. He saw only predators, ancient and remorseless, agents of a cruel, immutable law. His eyes finally settled on Luke. He stood slightly apart from the others, his posture subtly different, a fraction less coiled with predatory intensity. For a fleeting, almost imperceptible moment, Logan saw a flicker, a shadow of conflict in Luke's usually stoic eyes, a phantom of the quiet anxiety he had noticed before, a faint whisper of regret. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. Luke did not intervene. He did not speak. He stood with the pack, submitting to the unyielding ancient law that governed them all. Logan was truly alone. Silas Thorne stopped just a few feet from Logan, close enough to seize him, yet not moving to attack, offering no pretense of negotiation. His presence on the cliff edge was monumental. a force of nature as unyielding as the rock beneath their feet. His voice, when he spoke, was low but resonated with the finality of a death knell, cold and absolute, each word a hammer blow against Logan's raw nerves. "You chose your path, Logan Cole," Silas stated, his gaze unflinching. "You broke the rule that protects us all. You are a threat. There can be no other outcome. It was not a personal vendetta. It was a decree, an ancient, immutable law being fulfilled." In that critical, horrifying moment, as Silas took another measured step forward, closing the distance, Logan's hypersensitive hearing picked up a sound, barely a whisper, carried on the wind that gusted up from the churning river below. It was Luke, standing silently behind Silas, his voice barely audible, tinged with a profound, bitter sadness. "You're still one of us, Logan," he breathed, the words heavy with a terrible truth. "But the rule is above friendship. Always." It was not a word of comfort, not a desperate plea for rescue. It was a final, agonizing acknowledgement of the broken bond, a grim recognition of the ties that had been forged and then severed by Logan's own actions. A deep, searing pain, sharper than any physical wound, shot through Logan, a realization of the utter finality of his abandonment. Logan's gaze swept across the faces of the pack, then to the unforgiving rock behind him. There was nowhere to run. The merciless pack was ahead, their eyes gleaming, their forms poised. The sheer, terrifying drop into the icy maw of the river was behind him. There was no salvation on solid ground, no escape to be found in the familiar shadows of the forest. His options were exhausted. He had to risk everything. Without a moment of hesitation, without a second thought, Logan took a single desperate step into the void. He launched himself from the precipice, a figure of pure desperation against the bruised sky, plunging headlong into the icy, roaring torrent below. It was an act of raw, unthinking terror, a desperate gamble, a final, defiant challenge hurled at the face of an inexorable fate. The wind shrieked past his ears, the cold air snatched his breath, and then the impact. The river was a monstrous, furious beast, its current powerful and relentless, far stronger than he had ever imagined from the safety of the bank. It snatched him, rolled him, slammed him against unseen rocks with bone-jarring force. A sickening crunch echoed in his ears, then another and another. His bones screamed in protest. His skin tore against the jagged edges of submerged boulders, the frigid water sapping his strength with terrifying speed. He fought instinctively, flailing, kicking, using every ounce of his remaining strength, every animalistic urge for self-preservation, desperately trying to keep his head above the raging surface, to avoid being dragged under and dashed against the unforgiving riverbed. Against all odds, even as his body threatened to betray him, Logan clung to life with a fierce, burning tenacity. His limbs felt broken, his chest constricted, his lungs screaming for air, but the primal will to survive, magnified and intensified by the inhuman capabilities that now coursed through his veins, refused to let him yield. He was drowning, breaking, freezing, yet something deep within him, something beyond human endurance, compelled him to fight on. He summoned the last reserves of his terrifying strength, the raw, untamed power he had only just begun to understand, and with one final desperate surge, he thrashed towards the nearest stretch of rocky shore. He coughed, choked, and finally, with a guttural gasp, Logan hauled himself onto the unforgiving, stony bank. He lay there, half in, half out of the churning water, every muscle screaming in agony, his body a map of pain. He was battered, bleeding, shivering uncontrollably, barely alive. His vision flickered, blurring at the edges, the roar of the river slowly receding into a dull thrum in his ears. He felt his strength abandoning him, draining away into the cold, damp earth. He was at the absolute edge of consciousness, clinging precariously to a thread of life, the world spinning in a terrifying final darkness around him. Consciousness returned to Logan not as a gentle awakening, but as a violent, burning eruption from within. He lay on the cold, rocky bank, the sound of the river a dull roar in his ears. And the first thing he registered was not pain, but an unnerving, profound lack of it where there should have been agony. He forced his eyes open, and what he saw made a fresh wave of horror claw at his throat. His body, battered and broken just moments before, was mending itself with impossible speed. He watched, horrified and fascinated, as a deep, ragged gash on his forearm, a wound that should have been spurting blood, began to knit itself together, the torn flesh closing like an accelerated film sequence, leaving only a faint, angry red line. A dull ache in his ribs, where he was certain several bones had shattered, quickly subsided, replaced by a thrumming vitality. He felt the insidious crawl of energy beneath his skin, a hot, urgent current that pumped through his veins, rebuilding, repairing, transforming. This was not merely fast healing. It was a complete, monstrous regeneration, a grotesque mockery of life. The changes continued, accelerating with an unstoppable force. His hands, still caked with mud and river grime, began to thicken, the skin tightening, pulling taut, as stiff, dark fur, coarse as steel wool, sprouted rapidly across the backs of his fingers and palms. His fingernails, once bitten and rough, elongated and curved, hardening into sharp, obsidian claws. He flexed them, a terrifying, involuntary gesture, and watched in mute horror as they scratched deep gouges into the rock. A searing, agonizing pressure built in his jaw. His teeth, first the incisors, then the canines, pushed outward, growing longer, sharper, until they protruded menacingly from his gums, glinting wetly in the faint pre-dawn light. His face stretched, reshaped, pulling into something utterly inhuman. An ancient, untamed thing roared to life within Logan. It was not a silent internal process. It was a visceral, burning agony of transformation, a fire that consumed his very essence. Yet, inextricably mixed with the searing pain was an intoxicating, overwhelming surge of immense, untamed power, a raw, primal force that thrilled him even as it terrified him. His human mind, the last vestiges of Logan Cole, fought a desperate, losing battle against the encroaching tide of bestial instincts, a savage hunger that sought to subsume him entirely. He felt the very boundaries of his humanity dissolving, his consciousness fraying like old rope. He watched his new hands, the dark fur, the terrible claws. He saw his reflection in a small, still puddle of river water, and the image was a nightmare made real. His eyes, no longer hazel, glowed with a feral amber light, deep set beneath a newly pronounced brow. His face was elongated, his mouth a muzzle, his teeth bared in a silent snarl. He was no longer a man. He was a werewolf. Fully, irrevocably, horrifyingly changed. The jump from the cliff had not been an escape. It had been a descent into a deeper, more profound abyss. He tried to control his new limbs to force his transformed body to obey the commands of his still human mind. But his movements were clumsy, jerky, powerful yet uncoordinated. The beast within him, now fully awakened, thrashed and clawed, struggling for complete dominance over his mind, seeking to break free of any remaining human constraint. He could feel it. A raw, predatory hunger, a savage intelligence that was quickly overwhelming his own. The horrifying truth slammed into Logan with the force of a physical blow. The leap into the river had not been his salvation. It had instead plunged him into an even deeper, more profound nightmare. He had not escaped his fate. He had merely accelerated it. He had become the very thing the pack feared, the very monster he had never, in his wildest imaginings, wanted to be. He was the abomination, the full, terrifying manifestation of their hidden world. He was the one they would now truly hunt, for he was the embodiment of their greatest secret, their greatest shame. As the first sliver of true dawn painted the sky in faint, cold hues of gray and rose, Logan heard it again, the distant, unified howl of the pack. They were still hunting. But now their prey was no longer just a fugitive, a man who had broken a rule. Now they hunted a new, uncontrolled werewolf, a terrifying, destructive force that was a direct and undeniable consequence of their own brutal verdict. The horror had just truly begun. The transformation was complete, an agonizing birth into a new, monstrous existence. Logan stood, a hulking, powerful form on the rocky riverbank, his body now fully a creature of the night, a werewolf in its terrifying glory. He felt the sheer, raw power coursing through his new form, muscles coiling and flexing beneath a thick pelt of dark, coarse fur, senses sharpened to an excruciating degree, every scent, every sound, every tremor in the earth amplified 100-fold. He was no longer a man with enhanced abilities. He was a pure, unadulterated predator, a force of nature both terrifying and magnificent. The first moments after the transformation were a storm of terror and chaos. He clawed at the air, testing the terrible strength of his new limbs, his head thrashing as the beast within him roared for dominance. He could not control his instincts, his movements jerky, uncoordinated, driven by an ancient predatory impulse. The human consciousness of Logan Cole was a tiny, flickering candle in a hurricane, desperately trying to assert itself against the overwhelming, consuming darkness of the beast. He was a prisoner in his own body, a terrified observer to the savage awakening of an ancient hunger. A cold, existential paradox slammed into him. He had become the very thing the pack feared above all else, a fully transformed, uncontrolled werewolf. He was the nightmare, the monstrous outcome of their own ancient law. He was, in a twisted, horrifying irony, now a true part of their world, intimately connected by blood and curse, yet simultaneously a complete outcast, a breaker of the most sacred rule, a living, breathing threat to their very secret. He was the predator, yes, now imbued with terrible power, but he was still, inexorably, the prey. His escape had merely changed the nature of his cage. The pack, Logan knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, would not forgive this new, monstrous development. Their hunt would now be fueled by an even greater fury, a primal, species-wide hatred. He was no longer just a witness to be silenced. He was an uncontrolled, potentially destructive force, a contagion that threatened to expose and annihilate their entire kind. He was a rogue element, a wild card, and they would hunt him with a merciless efficiency, born of desperation. The game had escalated, the stakes impossibly high. The worst terror was the dawning realization of his ultimate fate. He was no longer entirely human. His mind, once his anchor, was a battlefield, the beast a ravenous conqueror. He did not know if he would ever stop the primal savage urges within him. He did not know if he could ever reclaim even a fraction of his old personality or his old self. He understood with a profound, soul-crushing despair that he was doomed to be a wild, untamed predator, his human reason slowly consumed by an insatiable, bestial madness. This was not merely a physical transformation. It was a curse, a sentence to an endless internal war. Then, from the distant shadows, came the howl. It was the unified call of the pack, a sound that resonated with renewed purpose, with a terrifying ancient fury. But this time, Logan did not merely listen in dread. Something primal stirred deep within his transformed chest. A guttural rumble started, building in intensity until it burst forth from his new, fearsome maw. It was his own howl, wild and untamed, a raw, inhuman roar that answered their challenge, a defiant declaration of his new existence. The hunt was not over. It had only just begun. But the roles, once so clear, were now twisted, blurred, and deeply, irrevocably terrifying. Logan, the monster he had become, turned his head, his luminous feral eyes sweeping across the dense, dark expanse of the Maine woods. He looked at the world through new, savage eyes, a potent ancient wisdom mingled with a primal, instinctual hunger. He was ready. Ready for the endless chase, the perpetual struggle, the eternal hunt. He was the living embodiment of the nightmare he had inadvertently created, a creature of pure, untamed horror, forever trapped in a brutal odyssey of survival. His future was an unending battle, not just with his former pack, but with the ravenous, encroaching beast within his own soul.